Yeah, so I should announce the next panel, huh? Our first panel for the day is titled, "This is How We Win, A History of Civil Rights Victories in Vermont," just to get us started feeling victorious and capacious.
All right, great. Well, I am going to be moderating this first panel. This panel, not a lot of the panels that we have this weekend were created specifically by HRC staff, but this one was. This was one of my babies. I call it the Wins panel because I think it's really important to be thinking about how we can use the lessons of our previous successes and build on them for today. And I'm just so grateful for our speakers who are here today. All of them are advocates who have been involved in really important state-level advancements in civil rights. Why don't we go down the row and just say who we are, and then we'll get started with more.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Robin Friedner-McGuire, use she, her pronouns, and I'm here to talk about marriage rights for same-sex couples.
I'm Keith Ghostland. I use Han, which is a gender-neutral pronoun that has no class affiliation with it either. I'm here to talk about the work we did for Vermont's Gender Identity Non-Discrimination Bill.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie Brown. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Commission on Women. I use she, her pronouns. And I am here to talk about expansions of protections against harassment and discrimination.
Hola, mi nombre es José Ignacio y soy parte del Comité de Coordinación de Justicia Migrante y estamos aquí para hablar de la Ley de Vivienda.
Hello, my name is Jose Ignacio. I'm part of the Migrant Justice Coordinating Committee, and I'm here to talk about the Housing Access for Immigrant Families Law. And my name is Will Lambeck. I'm also part of Migrant Justice, and I'll be interpreting between English and Spanish.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm going to start with Robin, right next to me here. Robin, can you give us an overview of the Freedom to Marry campaign, how it came about, and how you were involved?
Sure. Can folks hear me? There we go. I think it might be a refresher because I'm recognizing some faces here in the room tonight who were involved back in the day. The marriage equality movement throughout the country was a real multi-pronged strategy, and it was also state-by-state strategy with some level of coordination among the states and on the national level. So we're talking about on the judicial level, legislative level, and we also did a lot of electoral work. And Vermont, as Big talked about a little bit earlier, it was absolutely on the forefront, and it was absolutely clutch at certain times in the marriage movement to make sure that we rose to the level of full marriage equality. And I would say that probably at the center of it all, storytelling was like probably the essence of the entire movement, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But as some folks know here, the way that we got to where we are today is that it began with a court case that was Baker versus the state of Vermont. And essentially what happened in that court case was that three couples had come forward and filed a lawsuit, and the Supreme Court heard that case, and they came out with a decision that was pretty mixed. It was great in that it said that it was unconstitutional to deny same-sex couples marriage rights, but they didn't go as far as to say that we could legally marry. Instead, they kind of tossed it to the legislature and said, come up with a framework. And so all of the attention had to be focused on the legislature in order to try to achieve full marriage rights. And what happened then was, what came out of that was civil unions, which essentially were just state rights, and once you left the state, those rights did not travel with you outside of the state. I think what's important is to kind of think about is at that time, I mean, folks, some people just weren't even out at that time, and DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, had just passed only a few years ago, which defined marriage as marriage between one man and one woman. So you can just imagine what the political landscape was. And then here comes our little blue state that's like, we're going to give rights to queers to get married, basically. So it was a huge, massive win. And also it was a huge, massive compromise. And I would say that for folks throughout the state, it was a very bittersweet victory, and especially for those who are really holding it. I do want to mention that the baker in the case is Stan Baker, who was just an amazing soul who we lost this summer. And he was a pretty phenomenal human being and very central to where we are today. So now we kind of need to shift down to Massachusetts, because in Massachusetts there was also a court case called Goodridge versus the Department of Public Health. And I'm going to give you a very Cliff Notes version, but essentially that is the court case where they said it is unconstitutional to deny same-sex couples the legal right to marry. And so we had that right. Like there was a stay that was put into place for a short amount of time. But that shifted everything, right? Because in Vermont, it was about trying to get those rights. Now we had the rights, and if folks wanted to do something about it, they would have to take them away from us. And the way that that would be accomplished in Massachusetts is through what was called a constitutional convention. That means the House and the Senate comes together, they take a vote to amend the Constitution to take away rights. It was really significant because the Constitution had never been amended to take away rights. It had always been more progressive in providing rights. But I think importantly for this conversation in terms of strategies, there was a constitutional convention, an election, and then another constitutional convention. So there was a vote that was had, and whoever voted against us, we ran people against them during the election, and then we had another constitutional convention. And I don't know that we would have won that second constitutional convention if we were not so powerful during the during the election, for two reasons. One, we did really well, we kicked butt, but also it changed the whole, people understood that we were politically engaged and politically powerful. And so what happened with marriage rights coming to be in Massachusetts, and this also happened with civil unions, but people learned to live with same-sex couples being married. So all of the horrible things that everybody thought was going to happen, it just wasn't happening. People were getting used to the idea. More people were coming out. More people were recognizing that they had family members, colleagues, neighbors who were married. And the way that I came into this was actually during that time in Massachusetts. Right before the court case came down in Massachusetts, I jumped on with the Massachusetts Freedom to Marry, and I got involved. I was a field organizer during the constitutional conventions. I just want to say it was 6 a.m. in the morning to 11 p.m. at night, 7 days a week for like 3 years. I still feel that. You took a day off, it was a big deal. Anyways, so I came up here though, my wife and I, yes, we got married, came up here to the RU12 Queer Community Center's Black Tie event, and I met Beth Robinson. Beth Robinson is the person who argued the court case that got us civil marriage alongside Mary Bonato. And I'll never forget her saying, first off, I was starstruck by Beth Robinson because I had heard her name. I think I was the entire time I worked with her, but she had said, I want us to be the first state in the nation to pass it legislatively. Do you want to work here and do it? And so that's how I got involved in Vermont. And so it really was just on the ground, going from community to community, having conversation after conversation, any place that we would be heard. We were at nearly all of the county fairs. We were having house parties all over the place. Sometimes you'd have 2 people show up at a house party. Sometimes you'd have 20 people showing up at a house party. So it was a lot of education. We also were able to cultivate a good group of legislators who were willing to champion legislation. It moved through. We passed it. The governor at that time, Jim Douglas, vetoed it, and then there was a veto override vote, and we won that vote by 1 vote. So it was a pretty miraculous time, and there was a lot of tactics and strategies rolled up in that we'll talk about in just a little bit.
I know, right? Wow. Okay, we're going to move to Keith. In 2007, Vermont added gender identity as a legally protected category in all of our anti-discrimination statutes. This is now feeling more important than ever with the federal government's refusal to recognize gender identity discrimination as sex discrimination under federal law. Keith, please tell us about the push to make this statutory change in Vermont and how you were involved.
Yeah, I'm looking right at Susan. I need to do a disclaimer first. The LGBTQIA Alliance of Vermont has dissolved so that there is no legislative liaison position, nor is there a position to the office of the governor currently. The other disclaimer is I want to acknowledge the person who is my co-liaison, Brenda Churchill, who anyone who had ever worked alongside Brenda knows she was a force to be reckoned with and a strong voice on behalf of Vermont's transgender communities. And Brenda would be the person who would be here today to have this conversation with you. What Brenda would tell you, though, is that with the work that we did, and that my ongoing mantra starting back in 1985 was, who's not at the table? What is the voice that's not being heard? And looking at what is the legislative change that we want to make? Who does it impact? How do we reach out to them to get their stories? Because it's their face, their voice that our legislature and the public at large should be seeing and hearing, not mine. What that also meant was reaching out, explaining the legislative process to them, how to write testimony, how to write a letter to the editor, how to do a coffee with your legislator, how to prepare, for going out. All of those libraries that we went to over the years, all of those questions and answers, and what is your one-sentence tagline to define what it is that you're trying to accomplish before somebody misrepresents you, because you know they're going to. So we started in 1986 with a bill looking at non-discrimination based on sexual orientation. And along that process, we developed relationships. We reached out within our own LGBTQIA2S+, and if there's any more initials, reaching out to our communities to train us on the issues so that we understood them. And what happened is bias and hate-motivated crime happened, and that was after an incredibly unfortunate incident when someone was beaten beyond recognition behind the only gay bar in Burlington on the eve of Easter. We kept looking at, okay, what is the next step? This is what we have achieved. How do we build on that? How do we continue that work? How do we look at advancing those who are not at the table? And in 1999, Kate Hayes, who was then the head of civil rights enforcement for the Attorney General, because that Susan Sussman had left to go to the Human Rights Commission, which was one of our strongest allies, came forward to us and said, we're going to go back in and do some amendments to Vermont's existing bias and hate-motivated crime statutes we could include gender identity as one of those categories for which we are going to extend the hate crime statute for penalty enhancement. And it actually went through very little notice, very little pushback. Well, that generated Elizabeth Campbell, self-identified trans woman from Rutland, to say, you know, if we can do it in hate crimes, I want to do it in a comprehensive non-discrimination bill. So in 2000, a formidable force, she got a sponsor in the Senate, she got it through Senate Judiciary, she got it past the Senate. Then it got to the House. Keep in mind, this was in 2000. What else might have been happening in 2000 after the 1999 Baker decision? And it was working on civil unions. And Elizabeth said, you know, our community doesn't have the capacity to take on both of these issues at the same time. I am going to step aside so that our community can focus on civil unions, and that's where our resources can go. What was unfortunate is that following civil unions in the 2000 election, we lost the Democratic majority in the House. So that when we came back in 2001, we no longer had a supportive chamber where we could really advance or discuss the issue of gender identity. So we went back and worked within our community, building alliances, educating ourselves, because we weren't necessarily all that good on being able to state, this is what gender identity means, this is why it's important, this is why this legislation should happen. And at that point in time, we relied greatly on Out in the Mountains, which has now folded, to get information out to our communities so that people could do guest editorial explaining the issue, reaffirming this is how you write a letter to your legislator. This is who I am. I'm a constituent. This is why this issue is important to me. This is how it will improve my life. Thank you for supporting us. It actually wasn't, and we did introduce bills for non-discrimination based on gender identity, even with the Republican majorities. They didn't go anywhere because Peg Flory, who might have been the chair of House Judiciary, was not going to take up the issue. So it wasn't until 2006 when we had 5 out legislators who were elected for that year that Bill Lippert, a name that will come up again, introduced a bill, non-discrimination, gender identity and expression. Remember that phrase. You know, but because, and he got 8 of the 11 members of the House Judiciary Committee to sign on as co-sponsors, so you would think this bill would easily advance. Well, it didn't. It got stalled. And it got stalled again because of looking at what is the other work that needs to get done. You know, what are the other priorities? So it actually didn't get taken up in a comprehensive manner until 2006. And that was by the push of Jess Cross, who openly trans man attorney in Montpelier, who had already been working in the legislature, well known to them, really advanced the bill. It passed in the House, passed in the Senate, went to Jim Douglas, who vetoed it. And up until the point of his veto, he had given no indication that he had difficulty with the bill or that he intended to veto it. And the reason he had vetoed it was One, there had already been a case that had been brought by the Civil Rights Enforcement Division of the Office of Attorney General under Sandy Everett with a police officer in Hardwick who had been discriminated against, well-documented discrimination against them, based upon his identity as a trans man. However, it never went to trial because the town of Hardwick settled the case beforehand, but what Jim Douglas came back with is, oh, the Office of Attorney General believes that gender identity is already protected by the sexual orientation non-discrimination bill. There were not enough votes to override the veto. So 2007, Bill Lippert introduces it again in the House, and Senator Dianne Snelling, familiar last name, introduces it in the Senate. When the Senate passed it, there was only one vote against it. Went over to the House, and it passed by a 118 to 32 vote. That's a veto-proof majority. It went to Jim Douglas, who said, well, I guess I'll sign it.
Thank you so much for sharing that story. Gonna move us forward. Let's move down the line here and talk with Carrie Brown. In 2022 and 2023, Vermont eliminated the severe and pervasive standard for harassment in the workplace, in housing, and in places of public accommodations other than schools. This change is intended to make it easier for victims of harassment to prevail on their claims in court. Please, Carrie, give us an overview of how the effort to change the legal standard in our state came about, and what role did the Vermont Commission on Women play in that?
Thank you, Big. I have to say that the Human Rights Commission gets an incredible amount of credit for making this happen at all, for introducing the idea that we needed to make a change in our law that would address the severe pervasive standard that courts had been using. Wasn't written into law, but it was a standard that had been established in court cases where if you brought a case of harassment or discrimination at work, it had to be severe or pervasive, had to reach this standard. And maybe it sounds reasonable, but it was actually often used as a way to dismiss cases and to not take them seriously, and to say, well, you know, this is just the kind of thing that happens, or it was just a couple of times. And so to change that on the books was really, really key. The thing that's a little bit different about this law that passed compared to some of the other ones that people are talking about here is that it's a little bit nerdy and technical, and it's, you know, if you go out into we're not going to be waving signs about change the harassment standard. And yet, it is incredibly hard to to sue your employer because you've been harassed or discriminated against. And we know that sexual harassment is just absolutely rampant and continues to be. We've done many things to try to address it. It still happens, and it's almost impossible for somebody to take all the steps that it takes to figure out how to make a complaint, find who to send it to, find an attorney, go all the way to go to court and stand in court and talk about your employer. Almost nobody does it. So when they do, we want to make sure that they're really actually protected. So this is something that the Commission on Women comes at from the interest of women who have been continually harassed at work and who are unable to take full advantage of opportunities available to them because of pervasive attitudes of sexism and bias. And so let me just back up a second. this particular law that Big is referring to is called Act 80, and it did a few different things aside from changing the severe pervasive standard. And one of the things it did was it expanded our equal pay law, which had been on the books since the 90s, protecting against sex discrimination in employment. So it expanded it to also protect against discrimination in race, in national orientation, sexual orientation, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, and disability. And it also we had a law that in sexual harassment cases, this came out of the Me Too movement. We passed a law that said if you complain about sexual harassment and your employer settles with you instead of going to court, they cannot put in that settlement a condition that says you'll never be able to work for us again, and which was pretty common. And so if you're working for, the mom and pop gas station down the road, maybe that's fine. You don't want to work for them anyway. If you're working for, I don't know, Vermont State University or the state of Vermont or Walmart, and then it wipes out tons and tons of opportunities for you. All right, so that was available for sexual harassment. So this law, Act 80, expanded that protection to any case of harassment and discrimination. And so this is one of the evolutions that we really see, and part of why I think we're here today is that one group of people can identify discrimination that's been happening, an inequity that's been happening against them, start to move forward to change that, and then it pulls in others as we realize, this isn't just a problem for women being sexually harassed at work. This is also a problem for anybody being harassed or discriminated against at work, but also in their housing and also in public accommodations. And so Act 80 expanded it to all of those except for schools. And the process of getting this through, I had a really great time going back through all my old emails and everything to try to remember exactly how this all went. It was a roller coaster through the legislature. And I don't really know why. I think that's a discussion for another time. But it was first introduced in 2021, and it was really mostly just addressing the severe pervasive standard. And nothing happened in the first half of that biennium. 2022, the Human Rights Commission got really very proactive about trying to pull other people into this. So lots and lots and lots of organizations and individuals ended up getting involved in this. Aside from the Commission on Women, there was also the Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. There was the Office of Racial Equity. There was the Vermont chapter of the National Association of Social Workers who, excuse me, if you don't know them and haven't worked with them, you need to look them up because they're amazing when it comes to civil rights. As well as the ACLU, Rights and Democracy, Vermont. Legal Aid was a huge partner in this too, and then many others that I know I'm forgetting. So in 2022, this is the second half of the biennium, there were a few legislators who were really interested in making this happen. And so it started to move through the House. And, excuse me, sorry. It was getting lots of attention, lots of good discussion in the House General Committee. And then people seemed to have no problem talking about employment, no problem talking about housing, public accommodations. But then at the very last second before crossover, folks who work with schools objected to this applying to students in schools. And so there was kind of like, okay, wait, we gotta stop and figure this out. The bill didn't make crossover because of that, and so it just kind of went kaput in the House. And there was a lot of flurry and conversation with legislators and people who were working on this about, we're gonna combine this with some other bill, we're gonna get it through some other way, and there was a lot of great ideas, and it didn't quite happen. So that was the end of that for that biennium. So come back the next biennium, a much stronger bill that included all those same provisions plus some other ones, that is what we ended up with in Act 80, is introduced. And it started in the Senate this time. Went through the Senate, all good, except for this part about schools. And if we talk about obstacles, I can talk more about that. So it was a long trip through, and one of the things we had to let go of was that this would apply to students in schools. They would not have the same protection as everybody else. And then it got all the way to the end of the year, passed the Senate, passed the House with an amendment, went back to the Senate. And it got as far as getting back, the Senate got the word that the House concurred, or, you know, with their, and it was in, like, in the last hours of the night, or whenever they're working on their budget, and they just ran out of time and didn't do anything with it. But they came back for a veto session in June. And I know that there were a number of us who called up people or, well, you know, got them in the hall and said, you know, as long as you're coming back anyway, all the work's already been done on this bill. All you have to do is just do one last yes, vote for it and make it happen. And they did. They did. And it raced through, boom, 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 and got right to the governor, and the governor signed it, and that was all wonderful. So it was a roller coaster and a nail biter, and there's a lot left undone, and I'm sure we'll have time to talk about that as well, but I will stop there. Thank you.
I love the political drama. That brings us to our last speaker. Just earlier this year, Vermont law was expanded again. Under a new law that just went into effect in July, discrimination against immigrants based on their citizenship or immigration status is now expressly prohibited in housing and in places of public accommodation. We'd love to hear from Migrant Justice about what prompted that change and how you went about achieving that victory.
Sí, pues, bueno, gracias a todos por escucharnos y pues primero sí quisiera como dar un poco de contexto de por qué fue lo que nos llevó a luchar la ley de vivienda.
So yeah, thanks very much for having us on. And I want to start by explaining a little bit about why we decided to fight for housing rights.
Sí, pues desde que hemos estado aquí siempre hemos estado trabajando la mayor parte de la comunidad migrante en los ranchos lecheros, y ellos son los que proveen una vivienda para nosotros.
And so since our community first became established in the state, the majority of us have always worked on dairy farms. And the reason for that is because housing is included as a condition of employment.
Sí, pero después de la pandemia, en el 2021, 2022, se abrieron muchos puestos de trabajo para nosotros en restaurantes, en hoteles, para limpieza, en construcciones, en aserraderos, y pues nuestra comunidad empezó a salir de los ranchos.
But following the pandemic in the years of 2021 and 2022, more job opportunities began to open up for our community in hotels and restaurants and service industry and construction, sawmills, and so more and more of our community were leaving farms to look for employment elsewhere.
Sí, y pues los primeros empleos, como en aserraderos, ellos daban vivienda, entonces fueron saliendo poquito a poquito nuestra comunidad de los ranchos. En construcción, igual, algunas ocasiones, el mismo contratista daba vivienda.
And so some of those other sectors attracted workers by also offering employer-provided housing as part of the employment. So when workers were leaving farms to work on sawmills or with some construction subcontractors, they would provide housing as part of the job.
Sí, y pues primero nosotros, como para salir de un rancho, siempre pues se pregunta, ¿no? Como dónde vamos a vivir o quién nos va a dar la vivienda. Entonces ellos, los contratistas, decían que ellos daban la vivienda, que no nos preocupáramos porque ellos iban a dar una vivienda, pero nunca nos decían como qué es lo que implicaba que ellos nos dieran una vivienda.
And so, you know, if a job opportunity opened up and we thought about leaving the farm to work elsewhere, the first thing that we would ask the prospective employer was, well, is there housing provided? And so with like construction subcontractors, for example, they would say, yeah, don't worry about it, there's going to be housing.
Sí, y pues quisiera comenzar primero con un aserradero que pues ahí también estuvo trabajando un familiar mío y es de la comunidad LGBTQ. Entonces el contratista reunió un grupo de personas como de 10 o 12 personas para trabajar en un aserradero y dentro de ellos iba un primo y 2 personas más de la comunidad LGBTQ.
And so I want to give an example and connecting with the other panelists. There was a sawmill where a family member of mine went to work who is part of the queer community. And there's a labor contractor who said, yeah, we can get you a job here and there's going to be housing provided. So a couple people all went to work at this sawmill.
Sí, cuando el patrón se dio cuenta que eran de la comunidad, entonces él los separó y los llevó a una casa sola, a ellos 3.
And so when the boss saw the workers arrive and saw that a couple of them were trans, were part of the LGBT community, the first thing that he did was separated them out of the group and said, you're going to live over here in this separate house.
Sí, y pues mi primo me comentaba que ellos siempre hacían un buen trabajo y que pues no podía como el patrón correrlos por alguna cosa que hicieran mal del trabajo, pero sí les decía como que ellos no podían recibir visita en su casa porque no quería que se les llenara supuestamente su casa o su trabajo de más personas así como ellos.
And so, my cousin and the others who are working there were being treated differently. And they said, look, we don't think the boss is going to fire us because we're really good at the job that we do, but he puts all these restrictions on our housing. And he tells us, like, you can't have visitors at home because I don't want the house to fill up with people like you.
Sí, y entonces yo les decía que sí, ¿por qué no se salía de ese trabajo? Y él me decía, no tengo un seguro social para rentar una casa, he intentado rentarlo, pero no he podido.
And so I'd always ask my cousin, like, well, why don't you just go and find another job? And they would always respond, well, it's because I don't have a social, and so if I find a job that doesn't provide housing, I know I'm not going to be able to get an apartment.
En cuestión de las personas que trabajan también en construcción, los contratistas les daban un cuarto para 3 o 4 personas para que pudieran dormir juntos todos.
And then in the cases of people who went to work for construction subcontractors, they would say, we provide housing, but they wouldn't tell you that it would be 3 or 4 workers sharing one bedroom.
Ellos no tenían privacidad tampoco y también aparte de eso de su trabajo les cobraban por estar viviendo ahí hasta $500 por persona cuando ellos usaban un solo cuarto.
And so workers were living without any privacy for themselves, and then they were also getting charged for their housing. So it'd be 4 workers sharing a room, each one getting charged $500 by their employer.
Pues yo también me salí del rancho porque tuve una oportunidad de trabajo también en construcción con una compañía y a mí me tocó estar buscando dónde vivir también.
And I was one of the people who in that time left farm work because I had an opportunity to start working a job in the construction industry. But this was a firm that didn't provide housing as part of the job, so I had to go look for housing myself.
Yo también busqué por mucho tiempo dónde vivir. Fui a vivir primero con un primo en un rancho que me dio la oportunidad de igual ahí cuando yo estaba trabajando en construcción, pero pues de ahí la casa la tenían que remodelar y tuve que salir también de esa casa. Entonces hubo mucho tiempo que estuve metiendo aplicaciones y con el simple hecho de no tener el seguro social no podía ni a completar de rellenar la aplicación.
And so when I pursued this job opportunity, first I had to crash with a cousin who was still working on a farm, and so I could stay with him for a while. But then that housing went under renovation, so I couldn't stay there any longer. And I was moving around a lot, and this whole time I was applying for places to live, putting in my application to apartments, and each apartment application required a social security number. And so my application wouldn't even make it through the door.
Sí, en algunas ocasiones que lograba rellenar la aplicación tenía que pagar de $50 a $100 solo por que esa persona fuera a enseñarte la casa, pero no teníamos ninguna garantía que nos las iban a rentar.
And then, we would have to pay the application fees, $50, $100, just for them to show us the house, and even when we knew that we weren't going to be able to rent there.
cuando llegábamos a ver las casas y las personas nos miraban que no hablábamos español y había otra persona traduciendo para nosotros, ellos decían que no podían rentarnos por el lenguaje y se escudaban demasiado porque no teníamos un seguro social también.
Because when we would show up for the apartment showing and they would see that we're speaking Spanish and maybe we brought an interpreter with us, right away they would just say, we can't rent to you. How can we rent to somebody who doesn't speak English? And what's more, you don't have a social security number. They would always use that as the reason why they couldn't rent us an apartment.
Sí, y pues también cuando logré conseguir una persona que me rentara la casa fue porque un compañero de mi trabajo, él fue a firmar el contrato conmigo, donde si yo no cumplía algo de lo que decía el contrato, mi compañero de trabajo se iba a ser responsable también.
And so finally, the only way I was able to rent somewhere was getting a coworker of mine to sign for me, to vouch for me that if I didn't fulfill my end of the deal in the lease, that he would be on the hook for it.
Sí, y pues como yo, pues yo tuve la suerte de tener un compañero que me logró rentar una casa, pero muchísimas personas no tienen esa suerte.
So I had luck to have a coworker who was willing to be on the lease for me, but not everybody has that same luck.
Sí, y estaban viviendo pues oprimidos por los patrones de los trabajos o por los contratistas.
And so that lack of access to housing forces people to remain in jobs where they're being oppressed because they have to stay there with the boss or with the contractor because they need that housing.
Entonces, lo primero que hicimos es como formar la base de todos los trabajadores para exigir una ley que no nos exigiera el seguro social para poder rentar una casa.
So what we did was we brought all the workers together to create a bill to put in the legislature to say that they can't require us to have a social security number in order to rent an apartment.
Sí, entonces fuimos al Capitolio con muchas puras personas que ya habían vivido todo esto que yo les estaba contando. Ellos también fueron a dar su testimonio para que vieran que no es una ley que queríamos pasar de la noche a la mañana, sino que es algo que estaba afectando demasiado a la comunidad.
And so we brought the whole community together, and many people went to the State House to provide testimony and to talk to lawmakers to say, this isn't something that we're just pulling out of thin air. This is coming from our years of experience with discrimination.
Sí, fue una lucha de 2 años llegando al Capitolio siempre con más y más fuerza, exigiendo nuestros derechos para que igual las personas de las casas pues no nos siguieran discriminando, las personas que rentan.
And this was a campaign that took 2 years, 2 legislative sessions, and we had to keep going back and making our case and saying we need protection so that we aren't experiencing discrimination from landlords.
Sí, y pues la cosa que no nos dejaba pasar pues nuestra ley el primer año fue que también se reunieron los dueños de casa con la gente del banco, que ellos igual impedían que se aprobaran esas leyes.
And because we faced barriers during the first session, we couldn't get it through because the landlords and the banks got together and they opposed the bill.
Pues ellos querían seguir discriminándonos a todos nosotros.
Because they wanted to be able to continue discriminating against us.
Sí, pero pues gracias a todo lo que hemos hecho y a Justicia Migrante que siempre ha estado apoyando a la comunidad, y Justicia Migrante también es liderada por la comunidad de todos nosotros, pues hemos estado ganando varias leyes.
But because of all the work that we did and because of having migrant justice that supports the community and which is composed of the community, we were able to win this and many other laws.
Sí, es todo.
That's all.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. As someone who was in the State House, the last legislative session, I can say you always knew when migrant justice was in the building. It was a completely different energy, and it was really powerful and amazing to see the success. we're going to go on back down the row here, and I'm going to just put a question out to each of the panelists about if you could share a little bit about what obstacles you encountered when you were working on these campaigns and how you overcame those.
Yeah, there were a lot of obstacles, but I'm just going to highlight 3 of them for sake of time. And I'm going to start from going from civil unions to civil marriage here in Vermont. The first piece was that during the civil unions effort, I think like right now, I think a lot of people can say today that we are living in extremely divisive times. But at that time, that wasn't really something that people, I'm gonna say especially cis-het white people, upper middle class people, hadn't really experienced the threat and vitriol. And that really came out during some of the work of civil unions, right? There was a whole Take Back Vermont movement, and it was extremely divisive, and I wasn't here for it, but I would hear stories as we were trying to push for marriage equality, and we got the most pushback because people were saying, I don't want to live through that again. I'm still not talking to my sister. I'm still not talking to my parents. Our community hasn't even healed yet. I don't want to go there. And kind of adjacent to that, there was kind of this vibe that Vermont had done its part. Like, Vermont has done its part, let the rest of the country take care of the rest of it. And so that was a pretty extreme hurdle. And honestly, it was Beth Robinson driving day and night on the weekend, having individual conversations and hearing people's concerns. And I was in the car with her, but she was the one who talked. And hearing people's concerns and responding to them and really making the case for why it was imperative for Vermont to move to full civil marriage, because there was a real threat that the rest of the country was going to go to civil unions. So as the state that introduced civil marriage, we really needed to move forward on civil marriage. That introduced civil unions, we needed to move on civil marriage. So. Folks, I would say even as we started towards the legislative effort, and no other state had done a legislative effort, there was no model. And I think that people were feeling a lot of anxiety about it, and a lot of trepidation, including legislators, including some of our core champions. The second piece was there was such pride in gaining civil unions, and also I would say to the general public, civil unions was essentially civil marriage to people. People thought it was kind of the same thing, just kind of branded differently. So we had to really educate folks about the difference between civil unions and civil marriage and really make a case for why that mattered, the difference in the rights that were provided to same-sex couples versus heterosexual couples. That was really, I'll just say, was really surprising to me how much confusion there was in the state about that. So we really had to make a merit-based case for that. And that took a lot of time because it's also, you're kind of dealing with, civil marriage, civil union, like you're dealing with information that just doesn't really come natural to people. Like a lot of folks, they go get married, it's a celebration, and move on. They're not thinking about their rights, really. Which kind of leads me to the second piece, third piece, which I'm actually going to say 4. Okay, thanks. Was that the religious argument against it was still very, very strong, and people did not understand the difference between a religious marriage and a civil marriage. We had to really help people understand that we're not asking for priests to marry us in, a Catholic church. We weren't, impinging on people's religious values or their ideas around that. We had to help people understand that it was about getting a license, and from your city hall or wherever, and that it was completely separate, and that that was still, even though we had civil unions, that was still an important educational piece. And then the last one, which I think probably folks who have done work here today experience, is folks just don't understand the legislative process, and people don't know who their legislators are, and people don't feel empowered to demand and insist things from their legislators. I can't tell you how many conversations I had with people where I would finally get them to call their legislator, and then they would discover that the phone number to call was their home number. Well, that would just set us back 3 steps, because they didn't want to bother their legislator at home. It's like, no, that is the number on the legislative website. It is their home number. It is their duty to respond to you. You call that number. Like, that's their job. But those were the types of things that we would have to really coach people on a very individual basis. And so we had to help people kind of learn what the legislative process was. We needed to really teach people about the value and the power of their personal story, and why it mattered, why they were the expert, and that legislators were not the expert, but that they were the expert. We had to really help folks understand the power that they had and the different ways that they could exact that power. So there was a lot of training and education around that. And so there was, I think it took a lot for us to kind of, help shift people's mindsets in so many different ways. We were really fortunate that we did have just an incredible base of volunteers who were willing to do that work for us, that were willing to have trainings about the legislative process. We had trainings on how to tell your story. We kind of had this mantra, which I learned working in marriage rights in Massachusetts, which was make advocacy easy. So we literally spoon-fed everything until people got to the point where they were really sophisticated in their legislative advocacy, and you could just see people grow through that process. But we were we very much held people's hands through that process. So I'm happy to unpack any of that, but I think those were kind of the biggest obstacles.
There we are. Our biggest obstacles is what we were all taught. Everyone hears a story at some point in time about someone who is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex questioning, 2S plus. So you think you know who we are. We needed to find a way to help the general public and the legislators to recognize this is what you were taught. It is not necessarily true. Let me provide you with a different experience. Let me help you to see how what it is you were taught makes life difficult for me, or prevents me from having access to or the equal protections that you all enjoy. And there were different ways of accomplishing that. Some of it is we did Visibility Day at the State House. Pride Day started happening here in Vermont, and there was a real pushback. There was like, oh, you can be whoever you want to be, but why do you need to flaunt it? Mm-hmm. Because I'm fabulous. I'm sorry. And remember that phrase, gender identity and expression, that I had mentioned before? The expression part was an aspect of why Jim Douglas vetoed the bill. It's, oh, you're a man who's going to dress as a woman to get access to women's space to prey upon them, or, it's going to go out and, oh, you're one of those pedophiles who wants access to our children. When we did the original sexual orientation non-discrimination bill, it was originally sexual and affectional orientation. And what came up very quickly in the debates was all that stuff you were taught that I, as a gay man, want to prey upon your children. I had an affection towards children, so that the non-discrimination statute was going to legitimize it. So, and it was challenging to create those forums. We needed to create opportunities where there was a positive interaction, where the general public saw what we were contributing, and the Gay and Lesbian Fund, which came out of the Freedom to Marry movement, was one of those aspects. It was, we're giving money, we're donating services to things that you are benefiting, but you just don't know that it's coming from us, from within the LGBTQIA2S plus communities. So we're going to create a fund where we could all donate our monies, and then, such as with Vermont Public, if you look on some of the programs, it says this program was sponsored by the Gay and Lesbian Fund, so that there was something visible that showed how it is that we were contributing. And then the social and equity bill, and I saw Amanda wandering around earlier, that we talk about all of our histories. You know, that when you talk about Oscar Wilde, you know, as a playwright, you also include his same-sex relationships, so that people who are already part of your life have greater dimension, and some of that sort of bias that you were taught gently gets chipped away.
Well, a couple of the obstacles that we faced. One is something I referred to earlier about what a nerdy, administrative, technical kind of issue this was, and getting legislators to really take it seriously. As I mean, they took it seriously, but to give them that same sense of urgency that we felt for it, and that was a little bit challenging. One of the things that really helped with that was legal aid did a great job of getting people to come in and speak to their own lived experience and their children's experience in facing harassment and discrimination, and that, you know, really helped to kind of illustrate and make it a little bit more real to people. And obviously the other folks on this panel, that's the core of what they did, and for us that was something we had to kind of pull in. And at the same time, there was one of the things that I would say was a strength about this whole process, which was that we brought together all of these different people in the state who wanted to not be discriminated against, is that we were not able to meet everybody's, to satisfy all that at the end. So as I mentioned before, housing, public accommodations, employment, we did not face really any significant obstacles to that at all. People were like, okay, we can see that. But then when it came to students in schools, at literally the 11th hour, the School Boards Association, the School Principals Association came in and said, we have a big problem with this. We are very opposed to it. And then they dedicated a lot of energy and resources for the whole rest of the time to trying to stop that part of it. They had their insurance companies and lawyers who worked for their insurance companies come in, and I'm not going to try to characterize what their objection was, because I don't think I could do it fairly, but they succeeded in stopping it. And we had a lot of conversations about, are we okay with letting go of this, and realized, well, we're going to have to let go of this, and in order to get the rest done. But we'll come back next year and we'll fix it, we'll get it done. When we tried to come back, there was a lot of soul searching, I would say, from the organizations that were working together on this, and really not finding the support for that in the legislature that we had hoped. And so we all kind of backed off a bit. And for me, this was one of those lessons in that you have to keep your mind on, you have to keep your eye on what the major goal is, right? So I get very excited about the words in the law and what it actually says and all that sort of very behind the scenes stuff. But the real goal is that people are able to go to school, live their lives, go to work without experiencing discrimination and harassment. And that legislation is one way to make that happen, but not the only way. And so we thought, let's see if we can tackle this from some other directions. And so this is a work in progress. One of the things that we have 2 bills that are in the legislature right now that would expand and strengthen something called the Advisory Board for Hazing, Harassment, and Bullying. It's not exactly the right, I can get those in the right order, but it's a body that provides advice, recommendations, regulations for hazing, harassment, and bullying in schools. And that hasn't moved yet either. So we're hoping that next year, this coming year, we can do that. And so I think that, but the lesson learned there is that there are maybe lots of different ways to accomplish. We've done a lot about raising awareness. We've done a lot. We had a lot of people from schools come in and say, we don't want our students to be discriminated against. This is terrible that it's happening, and we promise we're going to do better. So now we're going to be thinking about ways to kind of hold them to that.
Sí, pues nosotros uno de los obstáculos que teníamos era como llegar al Capitolio como más seguido todos los días, porque pues las personas que estamos pidiendo esta ley, pues éramos trabajadores, somos trabajadores que pues trabajamos de lunes a sábado, a veces hasta domingo, y pues no tenemos a veces como la oportunidad de estar más seguido en el Capitolio.
So, one of the obstacles that we faced was just the time limitations of us. And we're a group of workers who are generally working Monday through Saturday, sometimes Sunday too. And so it was just hard to find the time to be in the State House, to be in the building.
Sí. Y pues la comunidad también se sentía un poco como oprimida por los patrones, porque si ellos pedían permiso y les va a decir como, oh, quiero pedir permiso para ir a una ley que me van a dar una mejor casa porque tú no me estás dando una casa, entonces ellos cómo iban a reaccionar los patrones. Entonces ellos se sentían como muy oprimidos, igual con ese miedo de que si yo digo a qué es lo que voy, pues me pueden hasta correr.
And we felt oppressed by our employers too, because how are you going to ask your boss for a day off so that you can go to the State House to fight for a bill that will allow you to move out of the bad housing that is being provided by your boss? Like you didn't feel safe talking to your employer about it, and so there's that sense of oppression that made it difficult to find the time to come.
Sí, y pues también pues como ya he comentado, las personas que rentan las casas, las personas que son del banco, pues ellos también no querían que se pasara esta ley, ellos querían seguir manteniendo el seguro social porque ellos decían que era necesario para ellos para checar un crédito, si a la persona que está rentando tiene un buen crédito.
And then I mentioned this before, but there was also opposition from the lobbies for the banks and the landlords, and they started out with this pretext saying that, oh, we need to ask for social security numbers so that we can do credit checks for our applicants.
Sí, entonces tuvimos que trabajar en esto también, como mirar a otros estados que ya tenían esta ley, que ya estaba funcionando y que no era necesario como un seguro social para checar el crédito.
And so we had to look around to other states and find examples where we could show the legislators that it's actually not needed to have a social security number in order to run a credit check. There were other alternatives out there.
Sí, y pues como sabemos, muchos bancos contratan a personas que están haciendo el cabildeo todos los días ahí en las legislaturas, personas que están prácticamente siempre en la casa del Estado, y pues nosotros no podíamos hacer eso, no podíamos llegar todos los días ahí, era un obstáculo, y muchos legisladores pues preferían como creerle a esas personas que están todos los días ahí en el Capitolio y no a la comunidad que estaba sufriendo demasiado.
But these banks and institutions, and they have the money to pay lobbyists who are going to be in the State House every day. They're there 24/7 basically, and for us, it was a struggle to be there, and so you saw that imbalance. And what we learned is that many legislators are going to give deference to the lobbyists who are there every day and that they're interacting with all the time, and they're going to believe them over us.
Sí, pues de mucho tiempo pues logramos superar esos retos y aquí estamos.
But through a lot of struggle and over a long time, we were able to overcome those obstacles, and that's why we are where we are today.
Thank you so much, each of you. I'm going to kind of squeeze together what we had 2 questions left, but we're going to squeeze those together into one. And I'm going to ask each of you to just briefly remark on what lessons you have learned that you would like to pass on to future movement leaders, especially if you can speak to lessons around working at the grassroots community level to impact legal changes.
Take me a minute. Yeah, I think that, I mean, I know that people say this all the time, but it just remains true. I think that the storytelling and trying to humanize whatever the issue is remains very important. It's how we connect on a very human level. And I kind of want to give voice to the fact that it can also be exploitive and extractive. And I think that trying to figure out how to do it in a way that it's authentic and that it's powerful really has to be centered in whatever work that is being done. And in helping folks realize their strength in their own story, because I think in our culture and our society, like we are so, especially with marginalized communities, we are so told how unworthy we are in so many different ways. And I think leaders within any movement can help really kind of flip that for folks and their understanding. I think with legislative work, one of the things that we did to really be strategic, we actually hired a lobbying firm. We would call them white hat lobbyists. I don't know how true that was actually looking back, but the thing that was really helpful about that, and I know that people have very mixed feelings about it, but I just want to name that they had the relationships inside the State House building, and they knew the personalities and the people very well. They kind of understood what made them tick. They understood what their concerns were. They understood what the barriers were for those legislators. And they would communicate that to us, and then we could go to the constituents in their districts and help educate the constituents in their districts, and they could do what they needed to do with that information. Absent that, we really didn't have that sort of insight, and so that was really useful. And I know that a lot of organizations and entities don't have that opportunity. It is sometimes you can contract somebody for a short term to help you do some assessment and some strategy. And that is really extremely helpful. And also really think about, you know, it gets down to being really tactical of like the specifics of who you really need to convince early on that will help move other legislators because they're leaders within the State House, right? So there's a lot of opportunities there, and that was watching that in motion both in Massachusetts and here. I still hold a very deep appreciation for that. I think the other piece that was and still is really critical is it's really 2 things that work together. The less sexy one is database. I really think that can become the lifeblood of a campaign, is really connecting with people, getting their information, because then you can engage them in the different ways that they want you to engage. I can't tell you how many things that I have personally supported and I just never hear from them. I have to seek them out. And if I'm at a point in my life where, and this is true for a lot of people, everyone has competing demands. And if you're continuously communicating to me via email or social media, I can pay attention to you. And it's not because I don't care when I'm not paying attention to you. It's just that what's in front of me is what's going to be easiest for me to pay attention to with everything that I have to do in my life. And so the database really is important. It can be important when it comes down to a vote, so you know who lives in what district, if you're doing something that's legislative. And then I think the other piece is really like a strategic communication plan. Know what you want to say and who you want to say it to, and what the purpose of what you're trying to convey. We took the bent that we were trying to meet people where they were at, and some organizations and entities function a little bit differently in terms of how they want a message, right? But that was part of where we were at that point in time. And we tried to bring people along through education. And, you know, I think even at the time, it faced a lot of criticism. It depends on if you're working inside or outside of the system, right? So I think that also matters. But without the level of communication that we had, and it was things, right, like helping our activists and volunteers write letters to the editor, and we would have message points. We wouldn't write it for them, but we would say, here are some of the things that you want to cover. And it would include things like defining the difference between civil marriage and civil unions, you know, but we all had kind of a unified message around what we were trying to say. We did direct email marketing at that time. Believe it or not, Facebook was just coming online then. Oh, my word. We didn't use Facebook. That was for young people then. Now it's not. But so there was like a very comprehensive and strategic communication campaign that we implemented. So I think those are some of the things that, in my observation, were like very important to the overall campaign here, to really putting the pressure on legislators, in addition to the coffees and the lobby days and the visits.
The work is never done. It's always looking at where you've reached, what's still to go, who's not at the table, whose voice is not being heard. How do we create space for them? How do we support their voice so it's not us talking for them? Always being vigilant for, this is what I thought we were doing, but this is the result it had. At times, we do things from a position of privilege that we don't fully appreciate the impact it can have on those who don't have that same privilege. The last conversation that I had about political strategy and where do we need to go next with Brenda was looking at our definitions of sexual orientation, gender identity, and our non-discrimination statutes. Are those members of our community who identify as intersex afforded the same protections that we are?
Well, one thing that I mentioned earlier was that idea of keeping your eye on what the ultimate goal is here and recognizing that legislation is one way to get there, or it's part of a whole range of approaches. The other thing I will say is that we had a really expansive coalition of organizations that were working together on this, and the different groups had different skills and brought different strengths and connections to the table. So the Commission on Women, we're much more about research, education, information. We don't do the strategic, which legislator are we going to talk to on which day. The Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence is very good at being in the State House and knowing who the legislators are and what they're doing and what connections might need to be made there. And Legal Aid did an excellent job of bringing people who actually had lived experience into the conversation. And the Human Rights Commission was also the, kind of like the ones putting us up here and saying, go, do it. And so I would say having that broad coalition of organizations and individuals who come from different perspectives but also bring different skills is incredibly helpful.
Sí, pues para nosotros, primero pues es tener una comunidad organizada, pues saber qué grupos de personas son las que están sufriendo pues estas consecuencias y pues tener como también como varios grupos como yo dije, la comunidad LGBTQ que estaba siendo afectada por esto y la comunidad igual que estábamos trabajando también en construcción. Entonces, saber primero identificar cuáles son las personas que están siendo afectadas.
So it starts with having an organized community and having people be organized to take action together. And then it's also about identifying what parts of your community are affected in different ways. So as I spoke about a little bit, LGBTQ immigrants face particular discrimination in housing. Construction workers face particular discrimination in housing. And so making sure that different parts of the community are able to mobilize in those ways.
Sí, tener una idea clara de qué es lo que queremos, como tener como soluciones a esto, presentar una solución.
And having a clear idea of what our goals are and a solution that we can present of this is what's going to cause the change we want.
Pues después nos tocó ir a la casa del Estado a tener como los testimonios de todos nosotros.
And once we had built our bill, then we needed to be going to the State House and maintaining a presence there and giving testimony.
También pues llamamos a la prensa para que todas las demás personas que no están en la Casa del Estado, pero que pueden aportar también con su testimonio igual o apoyar a la ley, pues también que lo supieran también.
And we also used press. We would call reporters so that they would write stories so that people who weren't there in the State House hearing us directly would also hear our testimony.
Sí, hicimos también conferencias con los legisladores también, estuvimos dando testimonios para ellos.
And we had meetings with legislators as well where we could provide direct testimony to them.
Sí, y pues identificar a los legisladores que estaban con el proyecto para que ellos se sintieran animados también de aprobar esta ley y que sean como los campeones también.
And we worked to try to get legislators invested in the bill so that they would feel like they were the champions of it too.
Sí.
Thank you all so much. I want to make sure we have a few minutes for questions from the audience. And we have a staff person who can help. Dan will come if you want to raise your hand and you ask a question to the panelists. We do have a few minutes we can offer for that. I never turned it off. Oh.
Testing.
If anyone here has a question, feel free to raise your hand.
There's a question from the app.
Look at that, using the technology.
Why do you think marriage equality ended at same-sex marriage and did not subsequently expand to include abolishing the SSI marriage requirements that disempower people with disabilities?
I mean, I think that there's, I don't know, I think there's a lot of reasons why that happened. And I guess we didn't have time for this, but I think that, right, moving for marriage rights for same-sex couples was like, it was controversial, like within our community, as to why we were working on that when we were not paying any attention to trans rights. And I think there was an idea at the time that we were training kind of this, army, not to use war language, but I guess I just did, but like all of these volunteers and activists to move on and to do more work within the community. And I think that bore out to a degree, but probably not to the extent of what it should have. And I think that really the movement, if you were to look at it, it was primarily, led by like cis white gay men initially, and then it was, at some point I would say, cis white lesbians. And so, it was very kind of traditional, and it's in the nature of it, and problematic in that way. And it seemed like, for me, just from my observation, that people were exhausted and just kind of moved on and moved away. And I think that there were folks who integrated into other aspects of the work, but in terms of the marriage work, it just kind of, it stopped where it is. And I'm sure that there are some people who are watching who may take issue with my articulation of that, but that's what my observation is. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks for a really interesting conversation. It seems to me that within the context of what's going on today, with the urgency of responses to the attacks that we're seeing from the Trump administration on all kinds of civil rights that Big alluded to earlier, the situation, the context is very different than it was during the heroic struggles that you guys have described on the panel. I mean, I can remember, the reason why the legislature flipped in 2000 was the reaction to civil unions. Today, given the urgency that folks feel about that response and the real opportunity that we have in Vermont to elevate those issues and inspire movements across the country for what we can do here, sort of uniquely being Vermont, I strongly suspect that there's going to be resistance, but not the kind of resistance that you guys had to fight through. That we have a real opportunity to move forward aggressively with responses to what's happening. And it seems to me then that the issue is not how do you overcome those kinds of resistances that you guys have related, but how do we coordinate, because these are such cross-cutting issues across all the domains that have been here and many others. How is that coordination going to happen? How can, the real barrier will be, can we be strategic enough to put the right things forward that create the best opportunities? So I guess I'd like to ask anybody on the panel who has thoughts about this and knowledge about what may be happening, how will that coordination happen? How will we ensure that we're really entering this opportunity we have in a strategic way, and recognizing that it's mid-November in the middle of a biennium, so legislative responses are, we don't have the time for the kinds of long groundwork we've talked about. We don't even have time maybe for all the coordinating conversations that need to happen if they're not already happening. So what's going on there, and what are thoughts that you all have to ensure that this moment can really be met now with the urgency that's needed?
Well, in the back of my head, which is a very cluttered place, I go back to when I first started doing activism. The instruction I was given by a veteran advocate was to go sit in the cafeteria at the State House, become part of the woodwork, and start looking at who else was there, what was the work they were doing, and then gradually developing those relationships, really building strong allies It's like, what is the work you're doing? How do I support you in that? When do I need to show up, as a white Vermonter showing up at a Black Lives Matter event to show my support for your voice without my speaking on your behalf again? It's really being conscious of who else is doing what. How do I support that? How do we extend that support to each other so that when No Kings does a rally on the State House lawn, 7,000 of us show up again? Or at the first rally during the first hostile regime, 30,000 of us show up on the State House. Just being very conscious, as difficult as it feels, to be present, to watch what's happening, and allow ourselves permission to act. Because that's the intent of the regime, is for us to feel powerless and inactive. Bite me.
I think I have to be real honest. Like, I'm nervous. I see what's happening, I think we're all civic-minded individuals and we're really paying close attention. But I've been in spaces where I have felt like I was with other civic-minded individuals and they have no idea what's going on in the world. And this is Vermont, and it's shocking to me. And I'll just speak from the perspective of like what's happening with trans youth in this country and trans people. There are folks who just don't even understand that there are people fleeing this country right now who are trans identified. And I'm this is going to sound ageist, and I just want to say I'm in my 50s, so I feel like I can say this, but the youth get it. I mean, they are so far ahead, and I think the way that we're going to get there is if we start following their lead more. They are not separating these issues. Before, it's kind of like what Keith said earlier. It's like, well, you can't focus on gender identity. You can only focus on marriage because we just can't handle that, right? Or when my organization, Outright Vermont, has sent out its position on Gaza and Palestine, we got so much blowback because people just did not understand the connection. And I'll say that was actually from like a certain age demographic. And so I think that if we want to do coalition building, it's not just a namesake or to sit at a coalition table and then like go to our corners afterwards. It's really about understanding the interconnectedness of the issues and taking action. And I think that following the youth and recognizing how important it is. And I'll just say one thing. When we've had at Outright Vermont youth talk about the priorities in their lives and what they want to see our legislature and our policymakers take actions on, it's things like healthcare, it's things like housing, it's things like ending discrimination, so it's like all of these issues. It's not just specifically focused on them in their identity as a trans person or a queer person. It's the wholeness of who they are, and they see themselves in others and vice versa.
We are running a little over on time, and I want to be respectful of our next panelists that are going to start a few minutes behind the original schedule, but that's okay, because after this panel, we'll all be hopefully going over to the campus center and having some more conversations together about what we're covering today and what we're going to cover this weekend. So I want to really thank these amazing panelists and speakers for their time today and for their work for our communities. We will be maybe just taking a few minutes break, 10 minutes. Was that an 8 minute? 8 minutes. We're gonna take an 8-minute break, and we'll start up our next panel, which is about policing in Vermont. Thank you again.